David sits frozen, holding sealed hospital documents with trembling hands. His daughter's voice echoes, "She would never." On screen, security footage plays, but it shows the wrong person. A woman he fired, a life he destroyed, a choice that nearly killed his child. How did this billionaire's desperate mistake become a fight for justice that changed everything? Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. David Whitmore was a man who had built everything from nothing. At 52 years old, he controlled a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire that spanned 3 continents. He appeared on magazine covers. His name carried weight in boardrooms. His word moved markets. But none of that mattered when he walked through the front door of his sprawling Manhattan penthouse and saw his daughter, Sophie, sitting in silence. Sophie was 8 years old and hadn't spoken a word since her mother died 3 years ago. Not to doctors, not to therapists, not to David himself. She communicated through drawings, through movements, through a silent language only she seemed to understand. Her eyes were intelligent, aware, but locked behind a wall of trauma that no amount of money or expertise had ever broken through. David had tried everything. He'd hired the best speech therapists in the country, brought in child psychologists from Europe, consulted with specialists who claimed to understand selective mutism. Each one left with the same hollow apology. Progress would be slow. Maybe therapy could help over time, but no one could guarantee anything. David wasn't wired for that kind of uncertainty. He was a man accustomed to solutions, to problems with clear answers and definitive outcomes. Yet his own daughter remained unreachable, locked away in a silence he couldn't penetrate no matter how much he spent. The penthouse was meticulously maintained, every surface gleaming, every room designed by the best interior designers in Manhattan. It looked more like a museum than a home. Sophie moved through these sterile spaces like a ghost, her small feet barely making a sound on the marble floors. She had her routines. She would wake at 7, come to breakfast without being called, eat quietly, and then retreat to her room or to the living room where she would sit by the massive windows overlooking Central Park. She never complained. She never demanded anything. She simply existed in her own world, and David stood outside of it, unable to find the door. This morning was like every other morning. David woke early, as he always did, checked his phone for overnight emails and market updates, and showered while listening to financial news. He dressed in a custom-tailored suit and descended to the kitchen where Sophie was already seated at the long table. She was drawing in her notebook, her pencil moving quickly across the page. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Good morning, Sophie." She didn't look up. She never did. David poured himself coffee and sat across from her, separated by the vast table that suddenly felt like an ocean. He tried to eat something, but the food tasted like nothing. He pushed his plate away and checked his watch. He had a conference call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. Before he left, he placed his hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "I'll be home late tonight. Maybe we can do something together this weekend." Sophie's pencil didn't pause. She continued drawing, and David felt that familiar heaviness settle in his chest, the weight of failure that no amount of success could ever lift. The house staff had gone through several changes recently. David was exacting in his standards. He expected competence, professionalism, and most importantly, a respect for the delicate balance of his household. Sophie needed consistency, but she also needed space. Most of the women David hired couldn't seem to find that balance. They'd be too intrusive, trying too hard to engage Sophie, or they'd be too distant, treating her like she was broken. By the time David's assistant called him about a new housekeeper candidate, he was ready to give up on finding anyone suitable. The name was Aisha Williams. She had impeccable references, 15 years of experience, and availability immediately. When she arrived for the interview, David was immediately struck by her quiet composure. Aisha was in her late 30s, tall and poised, with an air of calm competence that seemed to fill the penthouse the moment she stepped through the door. She didn't smile excessively or try to charm him. She listened carefully to his expectations, asked practical questions about Sophie's needs, and didn't offer unsolicited advice or false promises. That was refreshing. David hired her on the spot. Aisha's first week was unremarkable in the best possible way. She arrived punctually, completed her tasks with efficiency, and maintained a professional distance from both David and Sophie. She cleaned the penthouse thoroughly but without the obsessive intensity of previous staff members. She prepared meals, managed the household, and somehow managed to be present without being intrusive. Then something shifted. David noticed it on a Thursday morning when he came downstairs looking for his reading glasses. He paused in the hallway when he heard something unexpected. Sophie was in the kitchen with Aisha, and Aisha was singing. Not loudly, not performatively, just a soft voice humming an old spiritual as she arranged flowers in a vase. Sophie was sitting at the counter, watching Aisha's hands move as she worked. There was something in Sophie's expression David hadn't seen in years. Not quite recognition, not quite connection, but something in between. David didn't announce himself. He stood in the doorway and observed as Aisha continued her work, sometimes singing a few words, mostly just humming. The song was unfamiliar to David, but there was something deeply soulful about it, something that seemed to calm the very air in the kitchen. When Aisha finally noticed David, she didn't stop immediately. She finished the phrase she was singing, and then turned to face him with a warm but professional expression. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. I was just arranging these flowers. The delivery came this morning." David nodded slowly, still processing what he'd witnessed. That was lovely. Sophie looked away from Aisha and back to her cereal bowl, but David could have sworn he saw something like disappointment flash across her face. Over the following weeks, David noticed more small moments. Aisha had a way of being present that didn't demand presence back. When Sophie was drawing, Aisha would work nearby, sometimes commenting softly on the weather or the day, not requiring response but leaving space for it if Sophie wanted to fill it. She never forced conversation. She never asked intrusive questions. She simply existed in the same space as Sophie with a kind of patient understanding that David hadn't been able to master despite his best efforts. One afternoon, David came home early from work. He found Sophie and Aisha in the living room. Aisha was reading a book, seated on one side of the room, while Sophie sat near the window with her drawing notebook. The television wasn't on. There was no forced activity or structured interaction, just two people occupying the same peaceful space. Aisha looked up when David entered, and there was something in her expression that made him pause. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was simply acknowledgement, and somehow that meant more than all the sympathy he'd received from well-meaning professionals. That evening, after Aisha had left for the day, David sat with Sophie while she drew. He wanted to ask what she was working on, what she was thinking, but he'd learned that questions often pushed her further away. Instead, he just sat quietly beside her. She was drawing a figure, a woman with dark skin and long braids, singing with musical notes floating around her. It was unmistakably Aisha. David's throat tightened. He left the drawing on the table and went to his study, closing the door behind him. He poured himself a drink and sat in the dark, wondering what it meant that his daughter had drawn this picture, and wondering why he felt both grateful and devastated by it. The following Monday, David received a call from his attorney in the afternoon. The situation was delicate and required David's immediate attention. Apparently, some valuable items had gone missing from the penthouse. A diamond bracelet that had belonged to Sophie's mother, some cash from a drawer in his bedroom, a few other pieces of jewelry. His attorney had reviewed the security footage, and there was one person who had access to all of these items at the times they went missing: Aisha Williams. David's stomach dropped. He felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at his attorney on the video call. "Are you certain?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The footage doesn't lie, Mr. Whitmore," your attorney said carefully. "I suggest we contact the police immediately." David ended the call without responding. He sat in his office for a long time, staring at nothing. His mind raced. The bracelet. His wife's bracelet. Gone. He felt a sudden surge of rage, followed immediately by something else. Despair. Because he knew what this meant. Aisha had to go, regardless of his concerns about Sophie's well-being, regardless of the small improvements he'd noticed. He couldn't keep someone in his home who was stealing from him. It was too risky. Sophie was already vulnerable. What if Aisha was capable of more than just theft? The thought made his blood run cold. He called the security office and instructed them to terminate Aisha's access to the penthouse immediately. He sent an email to his assistant asking her to begin searching for a replacement. And then, because he was a coward, he asked his attorney to handle the confrontation. He couldn't face her himself. The next morning, when Aisha arrived for work, security met her at the door. David watched from his office as they escorted her out of the building, her belongings in a bag. She didn't fight. She didn't scream or cry. She simply went quietly, with a dignity that somehow made the whole thing feel worse. David didn't leave his office that day. He worked through lunch and stayed late into the evening, filling his time with emails and conference calls and anything else that could keep his mind occupied. He didn't check on Sophie. He knew he wouldn't be good company anyway. By evening, when Sophie hadn't come down for dinner, David felt the familiar guilt creeping in. He went to her room and found her in bed, curled on her side, her back to the door. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, then quietly closed the door and went to his study. The next morning, Sophie didn't come to breakfast. When David checked on her, she was still in bed. He touched her forehead. No fever. He asked if she was sick, but of course she didn't answer. By the third day of Sophie not eating, barely drinking, and spending all her time in bed, David called her pediatrician. The doctor came to the house and ran tests. Everything came back normal. Physically, there was nothing wrong with her. It's stress, the doctor said finally. She's experienced a loss. Sometimes children respond to trauma by shutting down. You might need to consider therapy again, perhaps medication to help her through this difficult period. David nodded, but he knew medication wouldn't fix this. What Sophie was experiencing wasn't something a pill could address. She had lost something, and David had taken it away. By the end of the first week without Aisha, Sophie had stopped eating almost entirely. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and David found himself standing outside her door at odd hours, unsure what to do. He called the pediatrician again. The doctor recommended a specialized psychiatrist. David made the appointment but knew it wouldn't help. You can't fix this with therapy. You fix it by bringing her back. The thought came unbidden, and David immediately tried to push it away. But it lingered. One morning, David was in the kitchen trying to make Sophie's favorite breakfast, eggs with toast and fresh fruit, hoping maybe the smell would draw her downstairs. As he worked, he heard a sound from behind him. He turned around. Sophie stood in the doorway and she had her notebook. She moved to the table and sat down slowly. Her movements were lethargic, as though moving through water. She opened the notebook and began to write. David's heart pounded. She never wrote. She drew, but she rarely wrote. He moved closer, trying not to appear too eager, trying not to break whatever moment this was. When Sophie finished, she turned the notebook toward him. The words were written in her careful, neat handwriting. "Where is Aisha?" David's chest constricted. He sat down slowly, staring at those 3 words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something else if he looked long enough. "I had to let her go, Sophie. She was taking things from our house." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She picked up her pencil and wrote again. She would never. David didn't know how to respond. He wanted to explain about the security footage, about the missing items, about the responsibility he felt as a parent to keep her safe. But he also knew that Sophie saw something in Aisha that David couldn't unsee. His daughter believed in her, and he had destroyed that belief. He tried to explain about the bracelet, about his mother's bracelet, about the responsibility to protect what remained of his family. Sophie listened, her expression blank, then picked up her pencil and wrote one more time. "I want her back." David knew that wasn't going to happen. He had already terminated Aisha officially. His attorney had drafted a severance agreement. It was done. But the desperation in Sophie's written words haunted him. That night, David did something he hadn't done since his wife died. He called someone he shouldn't have. He reached out to an old friend who worked in private investigation and asked him to look into Aisha Williams more thoroughly. If there was any chance this was a misunderstanding, any chance she was innocent, David needed to know. The investigator called him back 2 days later with unexpected information. Aisha Williams wasn't her real name. Her birth name was Aisha Cooper. She had changed it after a legal case years ago. The details were sealed, but the investigator had managed to uncover some basics. There had been a workplace incident at a hospital where she'd worked as a nurse. She'd been accused of something serious. A child had been injured under her watch. There had been a settlement and she'd lost her nursing license. That was all public record could tell him. David felt cold. So she had a history. This wasn't just about theft. This was about judgment. He had made the right call. And yet Sophie's words echoed in his mind. She would never. What did his 8-year-old daughter see that trained professionals in security systems had missed? 2 weeks passed. Sophie's condition worsened. She had developed a fever that wouldn't break. She refused all food. She spent her days in a state of semi-consciousness, neither asleep nor awake. David brought in pediatric specialists who ran every test available. They found nothing physically wrong that could explain the severity of her symptoms. "It's psychological," one doctor finally told him with gentle concern. "Mr. Whitmore, your daughter is experiencing what we call a shutdown response to trauma. The loss of the caregiver has triggered something deeper, related to her original trauma. She may need to be hospitalized for observation and psychiatric care." David felt like the walls were closing in. He had tried to protect his daughter, and had instead harmed her. The realization was suffocating. That night he made a decision that felt like giving up, but which he understood was the only thing he could do. He called the investigator again and asked for Aisha's current contact information. It took 12 hours. When the call came back, David was given an address for an apartment in Brooklyn. He didn't call first. He drove there himself late at night, alone, uncertain what he would say or do. The building was modest, the neighborhood working class. David stood outside for 10 minutes before finally going in. When Aisha opened her door, she looked at him with a strange calm, as though she'd been expecting him. Before David could speak, she said simply, "How is Sophie?" That question broke him. He stood in her doorway and felt tears run down his face. "She's very sick. I made a terrible mistake." Aisha's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small and clean, filled with simple furniture and plants. On the walls were drawings, dozens of drawings. Many of them were Sophie's drawings, the ones she'd created over the past weeks. "How did you?" David started, but Aisha interrupted. "She left them for me before you sent me away. She came to my room while I was packing. She didn't say anything, just handed them to me one by one." "This one was her favorite," Aisha said, pointing to a drawing of the two of them sitting together, musical notes surrounding them. "That's when I knew you had to be wrong about the accusations. Because no child has ever given me drawings if they didn't trust me absolutely." David looked at that drawing and felt something inside him crack open. He told Aisha everything then, about the security footage, about the missing items, about what his attorney had shown him. Aisha listened without interrupting. When he finished, she went to a bedroom and returned with a small jewelry box. Inside was the diamond bracelet. "There's a video," she said quietly. "Your attorney didn't look at all of it. Your building's chief of security has been stealing from residents for months. When the federal investigation into the building starts next month, your names will come out. I wasn't going to tell you about the bracelet until it was all resolved. I was saving it as proof. I wasn't going to let you suffer for his crimes." David stared at the bracelet in her hands. He felt sick, ashamed, devastated. This woman he had accused and dismissed, was protecting his family while his own suspicion had nearly destroyed his daughter. What he said finally. "How did you know?" "I grew up poor, Mr. Whitmore," Aisha said simply. "I've seen what happens when people with power believe accusations without looking deeper. I've lived it. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to protect someone, I would do whatever it took. Your daughter needed me to stay silent and save proof instead of defending myself. So I did." David didn't remember driving back to the penthouse. He was operating on instinct and pain and desperation. When he arrived, he went directly to Sophie's room. She was awake. Barely. her small form pale against the white sheets. "Dad," she whispered when she saw him. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I'm so sorry." He pulled her close and held her, feeling her body slight and fragile in his arms. And then he did the only thing he could do. He made it right. The next morning, David called his attorney and explained that the entire case against Aisha was a misunderstanding based on incomplete security footage. He instructed a full investigation into the building's security staff and authorized an independent audit. He then sent Aisha a formal apology and an offer, one that felt enormous and also woefully inadequate. He asked her to return as Sophie's caregiver, this time with a proper title: nanny and household manager, with a salary that matched her value, with respect and recognition, and with an invitation to be part of the family. Aisha accepted. She returned to the penthouse on a Saturday morning. Sophie heard her key in the door, and something shifted. For the first time in weeks, Sophie got out of bed. She moved downstairs slowly, cautiously. When she saw Aisha, she didn't run or speak. She simply stood there, and Aisha crossed the space between them and wrapped her in an embrace. Over her shoulder, Aisha looked at David with eyes full of understanding and forgiveness he didn't deserve but desperately needed. That afternoon, David watched from his office doorway as Aisha and Sophie sat together in the living room. They weren't speaking. They were just being together, and somehow that was everything. Within days, Sophie's fever broke. Within a week, she was eating again. Within 2 weeks, she had returned to school with a note explaining she'd been ill. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Aisha had a way of reaching Sophie that no professional ever had. She didn't push for speech. She didn't force progress. She simply created space for Sophie to exist, without expectation or judgment. And in that space, Sophie began to heal. One afternoon, David came home to find them in the kitchen. Aisha was teaching Sophie to bake. They were making cookies, and Sophie was measuring ingredients while Aisha offered quiet guidance. There was flour on Sophie's face, and joy in her expression. David stood in the doorway, unseen, and felt something profound shift in him. This was what healing looked like. Not forced therapy or expensive specialists, just patience, love, and someone who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. Both Sophie and Aisha looked up. Sophie smiled, and David realized he hadn't seen her smile like that since her mother died. She took a flour-covered hand and waved at him. "Hi, Dad." The words were whispered, barely audible, but they were real. David felt his eyes burn with tears. Sophie spoke. It was only 2 words, but after 3 years of silence, those 2 words felt like a miracle. He looked at Aisha, who was watching Sophie with an expression full of quiet pride. This woman, who he had wronged terribly, had given him back his daughter. But the victory came with a shadow. David couldn't forget about the accusation so easily. There remained the question of Aisha's past, the sealed records, the incident at the hospital. He needed to understand who she really was. Before anything else could happen in this fragile new family they were building, he needed to know the truth about Aisha Cooper and what had really happened years ago. Over the next few weeks, David watched Aisha and Sophie build something extraordinary together. It wasn't forced or structured. It was organic and natural, the way real connection develops when there's no pressure behind it. Sophie started speaking more, not constantly, not like other children, but in soft whispers and quiet moments. She would point to something and say its name. She would ask Aisha simple questions. "Where are we going? What are you making? Can we read that book?" Each word was a victory, and Aisha treated them that way, acknowledging them with warmth, but never making Sophie feel like she was performing or being tested. One afternoon, David came home to find them in the art studio he'd set up for Sophie years ago. The room had mostly gone unused, filled with supplies that Sophie never seemed interested in touching. But now she was there, creating alongside Aisha. They were making a collaborative painting, and Sophie was laughing. Actually laughing. A sound David hadn't heard in so long he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. Aisha looked up and caught his eye, and there was something in her expression that went beyond professionalism. There was genuine care there, genuine investment in Sophie's well-being. David felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also curiosity. And underneath it all, a gnawing need to understand who this woman really was. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, David asked Aisha if they could talk. They sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling below them through the massive windows. Aisha sat with the same calm composure she always maintained, hands folded in her lap, waiting. "I need to know about your past," David said finally. "Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to understand. I need to know what happened at the hospital, why your records are sealed." Aisha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "That's a painful story, Mr. Whitmore." "David. Please call me David." Aisha nodded slightly. "That's a painful story, David, and I'm not sure it will change anything. But I think you deserve to know." She took a breath, and David could see the weight of memory settle onto her shoulders. "I was a neonatal nurse at Children's Hospital Boston," she began. "I love that work. I love those babies and the families going through the most terrifying moments of their lives. I was good at it. I was careful and compassionate and thorough. There was a family, the Hendersons. Their son, James, was born premature, very premature. He was in the NICU for 3 months. I was one of his primary nurses. I was there through some of the hardest moments, teaching his mother how to care for him, monitoring his progress, celebrating with them when he got stronger." Aisha paused, and David could see the pain in her eyes. "One night, there was a medication error. Not by me, by the pharmacy. A dosage was prepared incorrectly. James received an overdose of a drug that should never have been given in those quantities. I was the nurse on duty. I caught it within minutes, called the doctor immediately, and we counteracted the medication. James survived. He recovered without complications. But the hospital settled a lawsuit with the family, and I was made the scapegoat." David felt something shift in his understanding. "They blamed you, even though you caught the error." Aisha nodded. "Even though I caught the error. The pharmacy director was protected. The hospital's protocols were deemed sufficient. But I was portrayed as negligent, as someone who should have caught the mistake before it reached the patient. I fought it. I had documentation, witnesses. The timeline proved everything. But the hospital had more power than I did. They suggested I resign quietly. They said if I fought the case, they would make sure I never worked in nursing again. So I resigned. I settled, and my nursing license was suspended as a condition of the settlement." Aisha looked directly at David. "The records are sealed because I was a threat to the hospital's reputation, not because I did anything wrong." David processed this information slowly. "You could have fought it, legally challenged them." Aisha smiled sadly. "With what money? I was a young nurse working on a modest salary. The hospital had teams of lawyers. I did what I thought was survival at the time. But looking back, I realize I chose the safety of silence over the risk of truth." She paused. "I've regretted that choice every day since." David understood then that Aisha's silence with Sophie wasn't just a parenting technique. It was rooted in her own experience. She knew what it meant to be silenced. She knew the power of bearing witness to someone's pain without judgment. She knew that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was patience and belief. "I'm sorry," David said finally, "for what happened to you, for what you suffered." Aisha shook her head gently. "Don't apologize to me. I've made peace with my past. But Sophie is still finding her way, and I'm honored to be part of that journey." That night, David made a decision. He pulled up an old contact, someone who specialized in unsealing sealed records, and he began to dig into her past. What he discovered would change everything he thought he understood about justice, about protection, and about the difference between accusation and truth. The investigator who specialized in unsealing sealed records worked quickly. Within a week, he had obtained the full file from the hospital case. What David read made his chest tighten. The documentation was meticulous. Aisha had indeed caught the medication error within minutes. Hospital protocols showed that she had followed every correct procedure. The pharmacy error was documented, verified, and confirmed by multiple medical professionals. The settlement had been structured to protect the hospital's liability, not to ensure justice. The pharmacy director who had actually prepared the incorrect dosage had been quietly transferred to another facility. Aisha had been the sacrificial lamb, her career and reputation destroyed to insulate the institution from further liability. David sat in his study, holding the sealed documents, feeling a rage he hadn't experienced in years. This woman had done everything right, and had been punished anyway. She had lost her career, her license, her livelihood, all because she was a convenient target for institutional failure. And then she had come into their lives and healed his daughter without ever once seeking acknowledgement or recompense. The moral weight of that reality was crushing. David made a call to a lawyer he knew, one who specialized in medical malpractice and institutional accountability. He shared everything he'd learned and asked one simple question. Could this be reopened? The answer was complicated. The statute of limitations had passed. The settlement had been final. But there were other avenues. Other families might have similar stories. If there was evidence of a pattern of institutional misconduct, if other nurses had been similarly treated, it might be possible to build a case that went beyond Aisha's individual situation. It could become something much larger. David authorized a comprehensive investigation into Children's Hospital Boston's practices over the past 15 years. He hired retired medical professionals to review cases. He brought in lawyers who specialized in whistleblower protections. And he made a strategic decision that surprised even himself. He decided to tell Aisha everything. That weekend, David arranged for Sophie to spend time at a friend's house. It was the first time he and Aisha had been alone together without work demands or parenting responsibilities. They sat in the living room, and David laid out the documentation, piece by piece. Aisha read silently, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked at David with eyes that held both sadness and something like resignation. "This won't change anything," she said quietly. "The settlement was final. I signed away my right to challenge it." David leaned forward. "What if you didn't have to challenge it alone? What if we found others? What if we made this about something bigger than just your case?" Aisha's expression shifted. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. "David, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But I've made peace with this." Aisha looked away. "And honestly, I'm worried about Sophie. I don't want this case to become public. I don't want her to be part of some legal battle. I don't want her to lose me if you get tired of dealing with the complications." David understood then that Aisha's greatest fear wasn't about her own vindication. It was about stability. She had learned through hard experience that when you pushed back against powerful institutions, you lost. And she had finally found something worth keeping. A child who loved her. A home. Stability. "I'm not going to lose you," David said simply. "And I'm not tired of you. I'm furious for you. But if you're not ready for this fight, we don't have to do it. Not yet." Aisha looked at him, and David could see her processing the sincerity in his words. After a long moment, she nodded. "Thank you for trying," she said, "for believing me without question, for fighting for me." David reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I should have fought for you from the beginning. Instead of suspecting you, instead of sending you away. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to see your value." Aisha squeezed his hand gently. "You saw my value when it mattered most. You brought me back. That's more than most people would do." That evening, when Sophie came home, she ran immediately to Aisha. The joy in her face when she saw her was unambiguous. She wrapped her arms around Aisha's waist and whispered, "I missed you." Aisha held her close, and over Sophie's head she looked at David. Her expression was peaceful. This moment, she seemed to be saying, "This is everything." The weeks that followed were among the most ordinary and extraordinary of David's life. He established a new routine. He left the office at 4 in the afternoon. He was home for dinner. He read bedtime stories to Sophie. He and Aisha would sit in the kitchen after Sophie was asleep, talking, sharing, building something that was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as merely employer and employee. One evening, Sophie came downstairs after bedtime. She had her notebook. She sat between David and Aisha on the couch and wrote something. They both leaned in to read her words. "I love you both. I don't want anything to change." Aisha's eyes filled with tears. David felt his own eyes burning. "Sophie," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "nothing is going to change. We're a family now. That's forever." Sophie nodded and leaned against Aisha. Within minutes, she was asleep between them, exactly where she belonged. David and Aisha sat in silence, neither wanting to move and disturb this perfect moment. Eventually, David spoke. "I want to propose something," he said quietly. "What if you didn't work for me anymore? What if we changed the arrangement?" Aisha turned to look at him. "What do you mean? What if you were part of this family? Not as an employee, but as a partner. I know this is moving fast. I know there are complications, but I can't imagine my life without you in it now. And I don't think Sophie can either." Aisha didn't answer immediately. She looked at Sophie, sleeping peacefully between them. Then she looked back at David. "I need to think about that," she said. "It's a big change. But thank you for asking. For seeing me as more than just the person who takes care of your house." David nodded. "Take all the time you need. But know that I'm serious." David kept investigating in the background. It took 3 months, but his legal team found them. 3 other nurses who had been similarly blamed for institutional failures at the same hospital. One had left nursing entirely and was now working as a dental hygienist. Another had moved to another state and worked in pharmaceutical administration. The third was teaching health sciences at a community college. All 3 had sealed settlements. All 3 had been scapegoated. All 3 were reluctant to revisit their trauma. David hired a mediator and arranged confidential conversations with each of them. He explained that he wasn't forcing anything, but that he had resources and determination, and that if they wanted to tell their story, he would help them. 2 of them declined, but the third, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, agreed to talk. Over coffee in a neutral location, she shared her story. It was remarkably similar to Aisha's. An institutional failure, a nurse who caught and corrected a problem, blame directed at the wrong person, career destroyed. Patricia had been a brilliant diagnostician. She could have advanced to lead physician roles. Instead, she was teaching high school students how to take blood pressure. When David asked her why she was willing to talk now, she said simply, "Because I'm tired of carrying this alone. Because if I can help someone else avoid what happened to me, that's worth the risk." David brought Patricia together with Aisha. When they met for the first time, they wept. Not from sadness, but from recognition. They weren't alone. Their experiences weren't aberrations. They were part of a pattern. Together, with David's legal resources and Patricia's medical credibility, they began to build something larger. A case against the hospital for institutional misconduct, pattern discrimination, and whistleblower retaliation. The other 2 nurses declined to participate officially, but they provided documentation and testimony that could be used without identifying them. What started as one man trying to right a wrong became a movement. David funded the legal battle entirely, refusing any recognition or compensation. This wasn't about him. It was about correcting an injustice. The hospital fought back aggressively. They had powerful lawyers. They had institutional resources. But they didn't have documentation of a pattern, and they didn't have Aisha and Patricia, both articulate and credible, willing to stand up and speak their truth publicly. The case took 14 months to resolve. In the end, the hospital agreed to a significant settlement, policy changes, and a formal apology to all the nurses involved. Aisha's nursing license was officially reinstated. Her sealed records were unsealed and expunged from her official history. More importantly, the hospital established an ethics review board with external oversight to prevent future scapegoating. When the case was finally settled, David arranged a private celebration at their penthouse. It was just the 4 of them. David, Sophie, Aisha, and Patricia, who had become a close friend. Sophie made a drawing to commemorate the occasion. It showed the four of them holding hands, with light emanating from their joined hands. Patricia looked at it and cried. "You're going to change the world, Sophie," she said. Sophie smiled and squeezed Aisha's hand. A week after the settlement was finalized, David made another proposal to Aisha. This time, he did it properly. They were in the art studio with Sophie. He got down on one knee and asked her to marry him, not as an employee moving into a different role, but as his equal partner in life and family. Sophie was so excited she jumped up and down, her voice high and clear. "Say yes. Say yes. Say yes." Aisha laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." The wedding was small, intimate, held in the penthouse with Sophie as the flower girl. Patricia stood beside Aisha as her witness. Close friends and colleagues gathered. But the most important moment came when the officiant asked if anyone had objections. Sophie stood up. Everyone turned to look at her, curious. She had something to say. In her soft but growing voice, she spoke. "I don't object. I'm happy. Everyone's happy." Aisha started crying. David reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. After the ceremony, David gave a speech. He talked about finding what matters most, about second chances, about the courage it takes to believe in someone when institutions have worked to convince you otherwise. He talked about his daughter finding her voice, and about Aisha teaching him what real love looks like. When he finished, he raised a glass to the three people who had changed his life completely. Sophie, growing more verbal every day, asked to say something. She stood on a chair, her small voice carrying through the room. "I wrote something," she said. She held up a piece of paper. She read slowly, carefully, each word deliberate. "My mom died and I couldn't talk. Aisha helped me talk again. My dad hurt her, but then he was sorry. Now we're a family. Families are the most important thing. I love my dad and I love Aisha and I love Patricia because she's like my aunt. Love is stronger than anything bad." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the hardened businessman David Whitmore found himself openly weeping. A child who hadn't spoken in 3 years had just delivered the most profound statement about forgiveness and family that anyone there had ever heard. In the months that followed, David worked with Aisha to establish a nonprofit organization, the Aisha Williams Foundation for Medical Justice. Its mission was to provide legal support to healthcare workers who had been wrongfully blamed or scapegoated by their institutions. It would help them unseal records, challenge settlements, and rebuild careers. The first grant was awarded to a young nurse in Texas who had been made a scapegoat for a pharmaceutical company's negligence. The second was for a hospital worker in Florida who had been fired for reporting safety violations. With each grant, with each life changed, David felt like he was doing penance for the years he had wasted being defensive instead of seeing clearly. Aisha became the foundation's executive director. She worked part-time, giving her afternoons to Sophie. She was living the life she had been denied, helping others while building something meaningful with her own family. Sophie continued to speak more every day. She didn't have the verbal fluency of other children her age, and she probably never would. But she didn't need it. She had learned that her voice mattered, that being heard didn't require constant speech, that silence could be a choice rather than a prison. She returned to school full-time. Teachers reported that she was brilliant, creative, and had an unusual depth of emotional intelligence for her age. One teacher wrote in a report that Sophie was like an old soul in a young body, someone who understood things most children wouldn't understand for years. David read that and thought about how her silence had actually been a kind of gift. It had made her listen deeply, observe carefully, and understand nuance in ways that non-stop talkers never could. A year after the wedding, Aisha became pregnant. She and David had talked about it, and both wanted to give Sophie a sibling. When Sophie found out she was going to be a big sister, she drew picture after picture of a baby, of the four of them as a family of 5. She was excited in a way that showed how completely she had healed. The day their son was born, Sophie held him carefully, whispering to him. She told him about their family, about their mom who was in heaven, about their dad who worked hard, about Aisha who sang songs and made everything better, about Patricia who was their honorary aunt. She told him about love and family, and the importance of believing in people even when it's hard. David watched his daughter with his newborn son, and he felt complete in a way he'd never thought possible. The penthouse that had once felt like a museum now felt like a home. There were toys on the floors. There were drawings taped to the walls. There was noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of a real family. Patricia became a regular fixture, spending weekends with them, becoming increasingly involved in the foundation's work. She and Aisha had bonded deeply through their shared trauma and their work for justice. They were like sisters now. Sometimes David came home to find them in the kitchen, laughing about something, completely at ease with each other. That's what healing looked like, he realized. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of people who saw you clearly and chose to stay anyway. 5 years after that first morning when David heard Aisha singing in the kitchen, the Aisha Williams Foundation had helped 73 healthcare workers. Careers had been restored. Records had been unsealed. Justice had been served in different forms. The foundation received recognition from several major healthcare organizations. Aisha was invited to speak at medical conferences about institutional accountability and protecting frontline workers from scapegoating. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the system's failures and had chosen to work toward change rather than bitterness. Sophie, now 13 years old, had grown into a thoughtful, articulate young woman. She still had selective mutism tendencies when overwhelmed, but she had learned to manage it with the support of people who understood her. She volunteered at the foundation's office after school, filing documents and helping with administrative tasks. She had become fascinated by justice and medicine, talking about potentially pursuing law or healthcare administration. One afternoon, she sat in the foundation's office and wrote an article about her own experience of silence and recovery. It was published in a healthcare ethics journal. The article, written by a 13-year-old, became required reading in several medical schools. Students read Sophie's perspective on what it meant to be voiceless and what it meant to be heard. They read her words about the power of patient advocacy and the importance of listening. Sophie's article became a catalyst for change in how medical schools taught empathy and communication. David read his daughter's published article and wept. This child, who they had all thought might never speak again, had become a voice for countless others. The penthouse hosted a celebration when Sophie's article was published. Family, friends, foundation board members, and several of the healthcare workers the foundation had helped came to mark the occasion. Patricia brought champagne. Aisha made Sophie's favorite meal. David looked around the room at the family he had almost lost, the second chance he had been given, and the legacy they were building together. He stood and raised a glass. To Sophie, he said, for finding her voice and helping others find theirs. To Aisha, for showing us what strength and forgiveness look like. To Patricia, for joining our family and fighting for justice with us. To the future we're building together. To second chances. To love that doesn't give up. To family in all its forms. Everyone raised their glasses and drank. Sophie squeezed Aisha's hand. Their newest addition, now 2 years old, played with blocks on the floor, watched over carefully by Patricia. The baby boy didn't know yet what his birth had meant, how his arrival had completed a family that had once been broken. But he would grow up knowing that he was part of something special. He would grow up surrounded by people who had fought for each other, who had chosen each other, who had built something meaningful from pain and loss. Years later, when the baby was old enough to understand, Sophie would tell him the story. She would tell him about silence and how it broke. She would tell him about her father's mistakes and his willingness to admit them. She would tell him about Aisha's strength and Patricia's loyalty. She would tell him that families aren't always born. Sometimes they're chosen. Sometimes they're built by people who love each other enough to start over. The foundation's 10th anniversary gala was held at a prestigious venue in Manhattan. Aisha stood on stage in a beautiful emerald dress, speaking to an audience of healthcare professionals, lawyers, and advocates who had all been touched by the foundation's work. She talked about the importance of believing people when they tell you they've been wronged. She talked about the power of giving people second chances. She talked about how one act of faith in another person could ripple outward and change systems that had been broken for decades. David sat in the audience with Sophie beside him. Their son was at home with Patricia, who had become not just a friend, but family in every way that mattered. Sophie watched her stepmother with profound admiration. She had decided that year that she wanted to study law and medicine, creating a dual path that would allow her to understand both the clinical and legal sides of wrongful blame. She had already started volunteering with a wrongful conviction organization, reading case files and writing summaries for lawyers. She had found her calling, and it had everything to do with watching Aisha's journey from scapegoat to advocate. After Aisha finished speaking, she looked directly at David and Sophie. She smiled, and in that smile was the entire history of their family. The broken moments and the healing ones. The suspicion that had nearly destroyed them, and the trust that had rebuilt them. The silence that had once seemed permanent, and the voice that had emerged from it. When the gala ended, they walked back to their apartment through the Manhattan streets. Aisha held David's hand. Sophie walked between them, holding both their hands, swinging slightly as they moved. She was humming, something she did often now. A spiritual that Aisha had taught her. The same one David had heard her singing in the kitchen on that first morning that had changed everything. David reflected on the man he had been versus the man he had become. The younger David had valued loyalty to institutions over loyalty to people. He had trusted processes and procedures more than he had trusted his instincts. He had been willing to sacrifice a good person on the altar of protecting himself from uncertainty, that David would barely recognize the man he was now. This David knew that people mattered more than outcomes, that love required vulnerability, that justice sometimes meant doing things that were complicated and risky and uncertain. That trust, once broken, could be rebuilt if both people were willing to do the work. The three of them arrived home to find Patricia and the baby asleep on the couch. The baby was curled against Patricia's chest, his small hand wrapped around her finger. Patricia's head was tilted back, her mouth slightly open, peaceful in sleep. Sophie carefully placed a blanket over both of them without waking them. She whispered to her brother, even though he was sleeping, "I'll tell you the story tomorrow, about how we became a real family, about how love is stronger than everything else." Aisha and David stood in the kitchen, making tea in the quiet of the late evening. Aisha reached over and squeezed David's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for fighting for me, for building this life with me." David pulled her close. "I should be thanking you," he said, "for forgiving me, for choosing to stay, for giving my daughter back her voice and giving me a reason to become a better man." They held each other in the kitchen of their penthouse, which no longer felt sterile or empty. It was full of life, full of love, full of the kind of meaning that money could never buy. As David sat in his study one evening, looking at photographs from throughout the years, he thought about the man he had been. The billionaire who thought money could solve everything. The father who had failed his daughter through suspicion and pride. The employer who had immediately believed accusations without seeking truth. That man felt like someone else now. He had been remade by the people he loved, by a woman who could have been bitter but chose grace instead, by a daughter who had found her voice and used it to speak for others, by friends who had shown him that justice and love were worth fighting for. He thought about what he would tell his younger self if he could go back to that morning when Aisha first started working at the penthouse. He would say, "Pay attention. The most important things in life don't come through email or balance sheets. They come through the people you invite into your home, the second chances you give, the willingness to admit when you're wrong." He would say, "Listen to your daughter. She sees things you can't. She knows who is worthy of trust before your mind catches up." He would say, "Don't be afraid to be changed by the people you love. The version of yourself that emerges from that process will be better. It will be wiser. It will be human." He would say, "Institutions will fail you. People will disappoint you. But some people, if you're very lucky, will surprise you with their capacity for forgiveness and strength. Hold those people close. Build a life with them. Make them your family not because of blood or obligation, but because of choice." That night, David went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Sophie's room. She was reading in bed, a thick novel beside her. She looked up and smiled. "Dad, she said. "I've been reading about wrongful conviction law. I think I want to help people like Aisha, but with the justice system. Will you help me?" David felt his eyes burn. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." Sophie nodded and returned to her book. David stood there a moment longer, taking in the simple beauty of this moment. His daughter, reading, thinking, planning her future, speaking her thoughts with clarity and confidence. This was the real miracle, not the expensive therapy or the prestigious specialists or the money thrown at problems. The real miracle was choosing to see clearly, choosing to believe, and having the courage to start over. He thought about how far Sophie had come. From a child who couldn't speak a single word to a young woman who could articulate complex ideas about justice and morality. The transformation hadn't come from any single intervention or therapy or specialist. It had come from being loved by people who saw her clearly and believed in her potential. It had come from her stepmother, who had lived through her own betrayal and had chosen not to let that bitterness poison her approach to caring for a wounded child. It had come from her father, who had been willing to admit his mistakes and change his entire worldview. David closed Sophie's door softly and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom where Aisha was reading in bed. He slipped under the covers beside her. She turned and kissed him gently. "Everything okay?" she asked. "More than okay," David said. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am. For all of this. For you. For our family." Aisha nestled against him. "This is real, you know," she said. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'm going to wake up, and this will all have been a dream. That I'll still be working in that small apartment in Brooklyn, alone, still carrying the weight of what happened to me." David tightened his arms around her. "This is real," he said firmly, "and you're never going to be alone again. I promise you that." They fell asleep like that, holding each other, the kind of deep and peaceful sleep that only comes when you know you're truly home. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.